Hello, and welcome to Expected Value, the podcast that goes inside the sports analytics world. I'm Paul Carr from True Media. This is episode 60 of the show, the Chuck Bednarik episode, if you will. He was a Hall of Fame two-way player while wearing number 60 with the Eagles in the 50s and 60s. And in this show, we also have a guest who does a couple different things well herself. More than a couple things, really. She is Tegan Ashby, the Philadelphia Phillies Assistant Director of Software Engineering in their Baseball Research and Development Department. Before joining the Phillies this year, she worked for the 76ers and the Nets in the NBA, and I'm pretty confident she's the first person we've had on the pod who majored in linguistics and studied ancient languages in college and grad school. So, in this episode, Tegan and I will talk about what a software developer does for baseball and basketball teams and the differences in working in the two sports. We'll talk about the kinds and volume of data that teams deal with, what an NBA engineering team looks like, balancing form and function as an engineer, her transition from linguistics studies to software development, how studying those ancient languages helps with programming, her recommendations on learning to process sports data, her Women in Sports Data initiative, the world's oldest spreadsheets, and her favorite kind of pie. That is, the baking kind of pie, not the mathematical constant. Then, producer Sergio de la Espriella will join me to react and wrap things up. Without further ado, here's the Expected Value conversation with the Philadelphia Phillies' Tegan Ashby. We're joined now on Expected Value by Tegan Ashby, Phillies Assistant Director of Software Engineering in their baseball R&D group. Tegan, thank you for joining us on the show. Let me start with just super high level. For those who aren't in the computer science, data science type of world, what does a software engineer do? What are you doing, very roughly speaking, on a day-to-day type of basis?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here, Paul. Interesting question because I think software engineers, like the archetypical idea is, oh, like they just code all day. But the role is really to design, implement, and maintain software applications. We're programmers essentially. So anything that you interact with on a computer is what a software engineer has developed.
So broadly speaking, for a baseball team, you're taking all the data and turning it into something that other team employees, coaches, front office people can use to find the information they're looking for. Is that a fair way to summarize it?
Yeah, exactly. So my team is responsible for developing the infrastructure and tooling that everybody in baseball operations uses to do their jobs. So our primary partners are our data scientists or quantitative analysts, but we also work with stakeholders across the club. So front office, strategy, coaching staff. As much as as we can do to make our team members' lives more about doing the baseball part of their job and less about like the administrative details of their job.
And what kind of data and volume of data are teams dealing with? Obviously, this has changed a ton in the last decade or so. What data are what are your kind of inputs, generally speaking, and what's the volume that we're looking at here?
Yeah, so our bread and butter is really tracking data, and so we receive tracking data points for our pitchers, our catchers, the players on field, the ball, of course, and that can be like XY coordinates, and something that has come to MLB pretty recently in the past couple of years is biomechanical data or skeletal data, which tracks certain key points on a player's body, so like shoulder, hip, joints, and uh, I can give a little bit more accurate estimates for an NBA game. So, for example, an NBA game tracking data follows a basketball player's position, like XY coordinates on the court, and then the Z coordinates, the height of the ball. And that produces about a million rows of data per game. Um, Tracking data with skeletal points would probably increase like that volume of data at least tenfold. And so you can extrapolate that to a baseball game where you're sampling tracking at say 30 frames per second, and for like pitchers and catchers, you would tenfold increase that to 300 frames per second. So it becomes this massive amount of data, sometimes on the order of like over a terabyte per game. And as you know, we play a lot of games of baseball.
Yeah, I mean, so I know this isn't quite your wheelhouse, but just from like a data infrastructure standpoint for NBA, MLB, it must be something that's just kind of exploded in the past 10 years as teams try to figure out how to handle all this data and just whether storing, processing all those things, let alone turn it into, useful apps and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like the great next frontier, especially on this point with skeletal data. The NBA is just starting to get skeletal data this upcoming season, and being in baseball now, I can tell you it takes a lot of engineers to be able to process this, to store it, and to make it clean in a way that is useful for our data scientists or our biomechanists or sports scientists to turn it into something that they can do their work, their analysis on, but also that my application development group can make tools that everybody in the organization can interact with and ask better questions.
Yes. Can you give us a sense? We'll do the NBA because you're a little more removed from that, having previously worked for the Sixers and the Nets. What does an NBA engineering development team look like? Just kind of from a number of people that are doing your main general task, whether it's engineering, development, whatever it is.
Yeah, so at the Sixers and the Nets, I was pretty lucky because I got to work with other engineers. But I'd say on average, it's not really a common job for an NBA team. You might have 2 to 3 engineers total if you're lucky, and that group is managing the all of the tracking data from games, the application development. On top of that, that our coaching analysts and players use. Um, it are like internal data sets, so like scouting information. That's all like specific to an organization. So we would consider that as a competitive advantage because you could be very specific of like what is data and what are we valuing, um, and it becomes like pretty grueling, I think, for a basketball systems engineer because you have like multiple jobs. I think that being a software engineer for a sports team, particularly basketball, because departments tend to be smaller, you do a lot of invisible work. And the people that you work with, the stakeholders that you're interacting with, like they can't evaluate whether you did the cleanest code. It was the most Pythonic, like beautiful, like object oriented programming style. They judge you on your output and also your basketball or baseball acumen. So you have to become kind of fluent in order to do your job, and build the right things. And to empower people to do their sports job, but you also have to be a really good programmer, and so you have to seek out like the practice and the feedback externally almost because your day to day is reinforcing that in a way that like if you worked for a larger team in industry, your entire department would be software engineers.
Hmm. hmm Seems like it's kind of the eternal battle. I know, we deal with it here on the engineering side too, of form versus function. I'll just say, where you can have what you reference, this elegant, beautiful, efficient code that pulls out all the data you need, but you also need some, for lack of a better term, like pretty way for people to access it. How do you balance those two things in your development world?
It's like the chicken and the egg. And I feel like I'm really lucky because I have a large team. So I manage both our data engineering group and our application development group, and that also encompasses like our DevOps and infrastructure and machine learning ops initiative. So I think that at the Phillies we're especially well equipped and designed to be a group that can handle. These large data sets, and have that like internal ecosystem where we are working to industry standards, and we are pretty strict about like the quality of our code because we're competitive just as the rest of the organization, and this is our craft and we want to be the best at it. um, but at the end of the day, like the best way to extract data from our databases is a query, but you can't expect a coach or a scout or a general manager to be able to do that quickly. So you either have somebody you pull that data for them, or you create tooling that is abstracted at a higher level, or an application interface that allows these people to ask their questions while removing some of the complexity of like how this data is structured underneath. Like we take care of all the plumbing, and you get to it's like an iPhone, right? Like you pick it up and you automatically know how to use an iPhone or an Android phone, even though like the programming underneath it and all of the data and the infrastructure is really really complex.
Any specific kind of tips, best practices that you have to make these apps development anything like easy to use for, a non-programmer?
Yeah, so I'm a pretty big proponent of design, and I think that your design isn't just aesthetics or making things look pretty. It's design of how you are structuring your application infrastructure, how you're writing your functions, like how you're structuring your code, and where you're like planning to share utilities. And so it's that intentionality of and an ethos of making things user and developer friendly that manifests into a product that that people feel joy for using. And I think it also is really important, especially working in sports, to develop relationships, like personal relationships with the people that you're working, because I think often it's kind of like the faster horse problem, where somebody's describing this pain point to you, like they want to get something done, and they feel like okay, like the software engineers are going to be the problem solver. They're going to help me, and so they really want to help us help them by describing exactly what they want. But often they're describing like, oh, I want a faster horse. Because they haven't seen a car yet. And so I think it's part of the job of a software engineer to think like big picture from their own experience as a developer, and you talking to people who are in this profession outside of sports. How do I build a car? How do I recommend a car? What are the steps that I can take to um, deliver what you didn't even know that you wanted to ask for?
Right. Right. So you mentioned a couple differences between working in MLB and NBA, the size of your teams, the data, the number of games. Anything else particularly different about that development world between NBA teams and MLB teams?
Yeah, so one of the things I really miss about working in basketball is that you can use data in game. So um, for an MLB team, due to just the history of the game, I would say.
Tradition.
Tradition, yeah, you can't have internet in the dugout, and so you can't have a live feed for, like, in-game recommendations, and you can't make adjustments based off of, like, a real-time app. I believe you can have something, in the dugout that's installed, to an iPad, that has been audited and approved by the league office, but it's not connecting to your systems labs. You can't have somebody whispering recommendations across the wire, and that's just the nature of the game. But in basketball, um, I've certainly been part of groups that were really progressive and excited to experiment with what kind of things can we do to support in-game decision making. Can we use data to make better challenge recommendations? Can we use data to alleviate maybe some stress about what's happening during the first half of this basketball game? And can it inform the kind of decision making we'll make with lineups for the second half? Like what kind of adjustments should we or should we not make? So I think that's like one key difference, is that like there's an entirely different domain removed from uh, product development between MLB and the NBA. But another one is because of the size of MLB's software engineering departments and R&D in general, and the longer history of sabermetric um, or sabermetric friendly approaches, in the game of baseball. I think that there's more of a it's more pervasive through the organization, and so there's a little bit more freedom to get into the weeds with certain things, which I think is fun.
So I want to get into your background a little bit because I think this is a pretty fascinating career transition for you. You have a bachelor's in linguistics from Penn and then did
Yes,
graduate studies at Cal Berkeley in ancient Near Eastern and biblical languages, literatures, and linguistics.
yes.
Obviously, not your normal background for someone who works for a sports team or is in engineering. What prompted that transition? How'd that come about?
Well, I'm a pretty proud Cal dropout. Um, Go Bears. Uh, so my undergraduate studies in linguistics, I focused on formal linguistics. I was really interested in the structure and form of language, and how do you um, analyze large amounts of information, how information is structured, which I think if you talk to a computer scientist sounds pretty familiar. And a lot of linguistics departments are either in a computer science department or our sister departments, which is essentially the case for me at Penn. But also, I think studying ancient languages is similar to sports in that you have to self service what kind of uh, programmatic applications you have available to do your work, because there's not really an industry available program that you can just take off the shelf to build a Sumerian dictionary or build an archive of texts and like auto lematize them and uh, parse them. Like you have to do it by hand. And it's the kind of the same story for like you can't really just go off the shelf and say, "Hey, can you build this rebounding model for me?" Or like, I have these massive data sets that are really specific. Can you like do quality control on the exit velocity stats that we have for the bat? So it's fairly similar in that you have to you get to ask really big, hard questions, and you use the same like fundamental tools, databases, programming languages, uh, to try and answer these questions.
So from I'll just call it a skills standpoint, there would be development engineering tools, programs that to an outsider at least you would not have been familiar with as a linguistics major and someone who studied that. How did you go about learning those specific tools and skills for a development role?
So I, as a linguist, I did have to learn how to program, and I was also really interested in working in the digital humanities space as a way to investigate these questions about the ancient world and ancient texts and ancient languages. So it's kind of like a dissatisfying answer in that I learned it in school, but um, I learned web application kind of for fun as a hobby, because I like making things. I'm a knitter. I like to paint watercolor. I like to bake pie, and it, it- making making web applications, making mobile applications is kind of like the same spirit of being a maker. And I just loved the process of learning how to learn, and sort of fell into working in sports because I realized that I could.
Any of these, you list a whole bunch of languages that you work on: French, German, Spanish, Akkadian, Sumerian, Sanskrit. Any of these in particular like apply to we'll call it the programming world? Like is any whether it's syntax or whatever it might be, anyone particularly relevant that maybe surprised you or helped as you made a transition in the career?
Yeah. So Sanskrit has been a big one. It's kind of um, one of the first programming languages itself because it's very generative. There's an ancient grammarian, Panini, that has like the first like rules for how to form Sanskrit grammar, or Sanskrit phonology rules called Sandhi. And that's like essentially what programming languages are and how they're designed. So that was really helpful. But I'd say Sumerian has been the most helpful skill, and maybe not necessarily from like learning how to write software, although that because of how few people get the opportunity to study Sumerian. Um, you have to build your own tools to be able to do so. But like the structure of learning Sumerian, I think provided a really good foundation for how to think about data and how to think about storing data and how you could surface something that's really esoteric or obscure to an audience, like even if they're an archaeologist, right? An archaeologist isn't necessarily going to be a fluent um, reader of Sumerian. And, how can you make like this sort of like really granular thing accessible? And Sumerian as a language is really interesting. It's a language isolate, so it's like a language like Basque, so it doesn't have any other known relatives. Like structurally, it's really different from, say, an English or a French. So it's an ergative, absolutive language. So, like instead of having like subject and object markers, it has agent markers. So it depends on like the transitivity of the verb. And so like learning how to study those paradigms without having a reference is exactly like learning how to program in Python. And that like you have to like look for patterns and think about like why is this why is this syntax this way, and what are like other patterns in like Java or JavaScript, which are entirely different, and what do I know about like the inherent structure that I can use to abstract for acquiring this skill.
Yeah. Yeah. The more you explain the, I don't know, parallels or connections between, let's say, linguistics and programming, the more it makes sense. It definitely feels a little counterintuitive at first, but it does make sense the more you talk through it. I have to ask, several of your, bios stuff, you mentioned maybe kind of jokingly that you were studying the world's oldest spreadsheets. What do the world's oldest spreadsheets look like? Like, very curious. Like, what are the original spreadsheets, if you will?
So these are cuneiform tablets, which are written in either Sumerian or Akkadian. And these texts come from uh, Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia. Akkadian is a Semitic language, and Sumerian is that language isolate. And yeah, they're kind of like these clay tablets. They're almost like paperback sized, and they're incised with a reed stylus, and the script almost like I would say looks like chicken scratch, and it's in part because of like how they were read. Like you're using shadow to see what the sign and what the form of the sign looks like. But I think so. Jokingly, like these are like this data set of text is really interesting because this is the most like documented period in human history up until the Industrial Revolution, particularly this period called the Ur-3 period, which is about like 100 years, uh, about 4,000 years ago. And the vast majority of these text genres are basically like receipts or like accounting texts of like, okay, like, like this many hectares of this type of wheat, and we funneled it into this temple on this date. And so it's like almost like an archive of records. It's like being an accountant. And so like part of the process of learning or investigating these archives and trying to reconstruct ancient societies is you have to read a lot of these texts, and they say a lot of the same things. And it's always reminded me of the structure of an Excel spreadsheet, or like even like my bank account statements.
Right, right. Yeah, it's a big ledger in stone or clay or whatever it might be. Uh, for just go back to kind of the engineering thing, for someone who's interested in learning software engineering with the goal of working for a sports team, is anything specific that is kind of sports specific? Obviously, you can study in school. Was there anything kind of sports specific you would recommend people get familiar with if that's the direction they want to go?
Yeah, so I've been really spoiled working in sports because I have access to all of these proprietary data sets, and I have the budget to pay a vendor for these tracking data. It's not normally available to the public, but there's a really great open source community for working with sports data, and I'd highly recommend people seek out. Um, Things like Sport Dataverse, or Pyball, which is a Python API wrapper for NBA stats. And it opens up the opportunity to work with both NBA and WNBA data. And it's also a wonderful package written by one of my colleagues here at the Phillies, Pat McFarland. And I think that like these kinds of resources are useful for a couple of reasons. You learn how to access and interact with data. It exposes you to um, starting to apply sports analytics principles, like, learning how to ask questions of data, and to structure it in a certain way. And then I would go like a second step further, and I would say almost like think about like, okay, you've accessed this data, and now um, how would you almost like uh, in a very persnickety way, like manage it and store it. And I've always talked with some fellow engineers working in professional sports, and I'm like, man, like I wish we had a hackathon or uh, like a project, right? Like a application project where we didn't ask anybody to do the analysis work. They just pulled the data down or scraped the data, put it in a database, threw it in Docker, and then like that's it, right? Like you've demonstrated like this pipeline or life cycle of essentially like what we do on the software engineering side to make it more easily available.
Right. Yeah, those are the first steps that you often have to do in your world, right? Where you just have to you get the raw data feeds and you have to turn them into some, you have to organize them, make them a little more useful just as a starting point, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we're like Zen rock garden maintainers.
Uh-huh. So you mentioned or you sort of referenced initiatives and stuff, and so you co-founded the Women in Sports Data Initiative. Tell me about that. What is it? What do you hope to do with it?
So, Women in Sports Data is an initiative to amplify women's voices working in professional sports, especially on the team operations side, but across the technical spectrum. So, we include analysts, data scientists, and software engineers. And the goal isn't just to attract more women into our field, and it's not just to keep women working here, it's to eh, simply be a platform because I think being a woman in this sport or in this space is it can be pretty isolating. At the Nets, I was the only woman in the entire front office, and because our work in general is so clandestine, it's really hard to develop. Um, Professional networks and partnerships and learn from each other in a way that uh, I think our male colleagues have more readily access to. So the goal, we had our first symposium last summer in Brooklyn on the courts for the Nets, overlooking an incredible view of Lower Manhattan. And we also hosted a asynchronous 6-week sprint hackathon with data from StatsBomb from the men's 2020 Euros. And the goal is just to your earlier question, provide data sets of what it's like as close as possible working for a professional sports team. Um, Give guidance onto like what are the things that teams are looking for. Like our question prompt was you build an application and make a recommendation that a front office or a coaching staff would use. Trying to get more away from academic questions to practical applications of like all of this is in service of making better decisions, of making more competitive decisions, and helping people um, you be the best versions of themselves. So whether they're part of team operations staff or they're literally competing for the championship on the field or on the court. So it's a goal of normalization, but it's also more about celebration and amplification because we wanted, or at least one of my primary goals was, I wanted my colleagues, I wanted my general manager, I wanted my peers in the industry to see a day of women um, on stage speaking very specifically about um, what they do, their primary competencies, without having to answer the question, what's it like to be a woman in sports? Because the answer is like, honestly, it's not like always the best.
Right. Yeah. How can people support either your initiative or more generally women in the industry?
Well, for one, you can come. You could definitely come to the symposium. We're in the process of planning our second one here in Philadelphia, and should have some exciting announcements coming up in the next couple weeks. Uh, so come or volunteer as a mentor or amplify the event on social media and to your networks. But it's really just listening uh, and participating and making it a space where uh, we're all getting better.
Yep. Yeah. So womeninsportsdata.org is the website. We'll have that link in our show notes and along with some other things related to what Tegan and I have talked about. All right. We're going to wrap things up with our playing favorites segment where we rip through a number of your favorite things just to get to know you a little bit better. What is your favorite number and why?
Uh, I guess it's probably 12. And it's so growing up in Wyoming, we have only four-digit license plates. And so I like to play this game called the license plate game, which is trying and add or inject uh, formulas into license plates to get them to zero. So I like 12 because it's sequential, one, two. And then the next numbers, three, four, are you can multiply to get to 12. And so
Yeah.
it's just
It's
a nice number.
I like it. I like it. Favorite athlete when you were a kid?
Oh, I have three.
Okay.
I can't pick my favorites.
That's all right.
So my favorite athlete was Venus Williams, who I idolized when she won Wimbledon. And I think one of the coolest things about watching Venus and Serena uh, just utterly dominate for so long was that it was one of the only instances of like seeing female professional athletes uh, be acknowledged as the best at their craft, bar none. And also, it's just they're so powerful and so passionate that they really model like what it's like to be a champion and to be competitive. Another example, I used to be a springboard diver, so I was a very big fan of Laura Wilkinson, who won the gold medal in Sydney.
2000 Olympics. Yeah.
Exactly, yes, 10-meter platform. And my third answer is having grown up in Wyoming, I belong to the Church of Denver Broncos. And so my favorite Denver Broncos player was Champ Bailey. And I've always been a big fan of the quarterback.
Laura Wilkinson, one of my favorite Sydney memories, only because of the time zones. Like most of the stuff I had spoiled for me, but for whatever reason, I didn't know the outcome of that one, of that event. And so, like, I watched that, I'm sure it was 12 hours later, but I watched it, didn't know, and got very excited about it. So I like
Yeah,
that.
it was kind of a spoiler too.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a favorite pie to bake? You mentioned big into pies. You have a favorite one you like to make or eat?
So my favorite one to eat is sour cherry pie, but you have to be really diligent in going to the farmer's market because they're not available very often, like maybe 2, 3 weeks out of the
So it's a
summer.
specific kind of cherry.
It's a specific type of cherry. It's sour cherry. It's not like the cherries that you get at the supermarket. They're like more of like a bright red, and they're like the perfect level of tart for baking into a pie. But it's a lot of work to make that pie, and it's also very seasonal. So my favorite pie to bake, like as a regular activity, is blueberry pie, because it's really just like put all of your spices and sugar ingredients, toss and macerate with the blueberries, and then dump it into your pie shell, and then you're good.
Easy and delicious. What more do you need?
Exactly.
And finally, do you have a favorite "How did I get here" moment? By that I mean, this career's brought you to some interesting and cool places, and you're just kind of at a moment where you're able to take in, like, all right, this is pretty slick where I've gotten to go.
Okay, I have three, one for each team.
Okay.
The first one is probably a couple weeks into my tenure at the Sixers, and like I really did not like grow up thinking that I could work for a sports team, even though I had been a massive sports fan my entire life. I even remember like going to school and thinking like, oh, like how could I possibly work for the Eagles? Like I don't have any like skills that maybe the Eagles would want, but maybe I could like learn how to be a cheerleader or something. It would just be cool to like be in that space. And then I kind of forgot about it for several years. But I found myself like 3 weeks into my job at the Sixers. I had been tasked with preparing a postseason retrospective in collaboration with some of the data scientists with the team. And my boss at the time, who's now the AGM for the Portland Trailblazers, he brought me in and he was like, "So I'm going to put you in the coach's room because you did so much work on this. Is that cool?" I'm like, "Okay, sure." And
Uh-huh.
he's like, "All right, let's go." So I go to this coach's room, and Brett Brown and his coaching staff, Monty Williams was part of the staff at this time, were so warm and welcoming, like when I had started, but I'd never been in the coaching room in this environment. And I'd especially not been in a situation where I was responsible for presenting any work. And again, I was the only woman in this space. And Brett Brown, he did this really amazing, lovely thing. He has this fantastic, like Maine, Australian hybrid accent, and he just starts off like the conversation of like, "Listen up, everybody! Like, Tegan is really smart, and she knows all of these dead languages," which had nothing to do with the work that I'd done. It's just a proxy, and we all need to like listen and pay attention and um, you know really dig into this work. And at the time I'm like, oh wow, like that's so nice. But as I've been in sports, I've come more and more to appreciate just that gesture of establishing like, yeah, like this is a person who obviously didn't play NBA basketball, is not a professional player, but you can contribute in a way that we don't even know yet. And to reinforce that this is a space that's welcoming and we should give this person respect, was so powerful. And so I feel deep gratitude and deep affection for Brett Brown for having done that, because I think it really catapulted my confidence and sense of belonging in this space. The second story is a little bit more funny. During my first year with the Nets, during the draft, it was the first season in a long time that our team had multiple first round picks. And so we were part of the ESPN broadcast for draft night, and I was in the war room. And I didn't know, I knew that there were going to be cameras, but I didn't really know like exactly like when or what was going to happen. And we submitted our first pick, and about like 30 seconds later, my phone starts like lighting up because I'm just like looking very sternly, and there's like multiple pictures of me on ESPN, which I thought was like, oh wow, welcome to the league. And the third one is going to Clearwater and just standing in the ballpark for the first time and casually talking to um, our major league manager, Rob Thompson. And it was more of like a social event for the group of Phillies baseball ops who were down there at the time. And I casually mentioned to him, like, I may not be a baseball expert yet, but the one thing I do bring to the table is I've never missed the playoffs. I've never won, but I've never missed the playoffs.
It's a good start. You gotta be there to win it, right?
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing those stories. It's always great to hear just kind of people's experience in the industries. Thanks for everything you shared with us. Tegan Ashby, as Philly's Assistant Director of Software Engineering, thank you for being with us on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Paul.
Back in the True Media Studios, I'm Paul Carr. Thanks to Tegan Ashby for joining us on the show. You can follow her on Twitter at Bunsushi, Bunsushi. Check our show notes for that link, links to the Women in Sports Data Initiative, the Sports Dataverse she mentioned, and a whole lot more. I'm joined now by producer Sergio de la Espriella, another guy who's got a unique background and path to get to this sports analytics world that we are in right now. Sergio, welcome to the show. What did you take away from that conversation with Tegan?
Uh, Honestly, you just took my bit. It was great.
Oh,
That's
sorry.
that's kind of my thing, you know. I love being the non-data origins person that works in data. It's really good. I also love that only on expected value do you have to clarify which pie when referring to someone who likes to bake. I think
A
that is
bunch
a
of nerds here, let me tell you.
I know it was I was like, what do you mean you have to specify? Oh yeah, that's right. There's like this whole mathematical thing that goes on here. But that's what happens when you have a storytelling background and come into a data world. So no, that was one of my biggest takeaways in all seriousness, how she has this really cool diverse background. Those who listen to this podcast already know I have a really diverse background in terms of getting into sports data. And so for me, it was really cool to listen to someone else's path. Mine comes from the performing arts, from the theater, from music, all those things. And hers comes from linguistics and just being really smart because in order to have all of those, dead languages in your head and understand them, you kind of have to have a baseline intelligence, my opinion personally. But it was really cool to listen to. It was really cool how you were really in your and you said this before we started recording, so I feel comfortable saying it, but you were really in your nerdy bag. You really were able to kind of tie in together this linguistics background that she has with how she works with coding and with finding out how to implement data in the proper way and how the those linguistic dead languages that she knows can help her with these modern day computer languages that we're dealing with. There's a lot in the news about stuff like with AI and like everyone knows it's, or at least has heard of stuff like Chat GPT and stuff like that. But it's very interesting with how much these computers really pull from humanistic languages, right? They only know as much information as we give them. And so of course it's something I never thought of until I started listening to the interview. But it, I never thought that was something that could really integrate with technology in a way. You think those languages are dead, but really they're not. They're just kind of reimagined in a modern sense, and that's really was one of my biggest takeaways for sure.
Yeah, when I was prepping, I was going through a resume and you see linguistics and you see Aramaic and all these Sumerian, all these different languages. And at first I was almost taken aback, confused, like, wait, how do you make this transition? And then, I mean, maybe part of it's my 2 years of high school Latin coming, but you just start to kind of see, and she explained this much better than I can, but how there's carryover between syntax and organization, all these different things between these languages and coding. And I think it goes to what we've talked about this. I tell anyone who's interested in the business, like, you can get into sports almost any possible way and sports analytics, but whatever it is, um, because a sports team, we'll just call it, or a company, has the same kinds of jobs in a lot of ways that any company does. There's just obviously you're dealing in sports rather than whatever healthcare or whatever it might be. There are marketing jobs, there are sales jobs, there are communications jobs, there are analytics jobs. So, her path is a path. There's no right path. I think the only important thing that I always tell people is you want to be able to show what you can do for whatever job you're trying to get into. So, you can major in linguistics and kind of learn how to program, learn how to do software development. And if you have these projects and this body of work that you can show, that's what matters. Whether it's programming, analytics, or something more on a whole different side of things. You just got to be able to do it. The major itself helps. I wanted to get into media. I majored in communications. It was easier to have whatever a resume, tape, CD at the time, that way than to kind of do it separately on my own. But I could have majored in. I have friends in the business. They major in whatever it was, history, but you do games and all that, and you can still get there. So, yeah, there's just lots of paths. You just kind of got to figure out, where do you want your path to go, as is as important as what the path is.
Yeah, and I think it's also very poignant that it's not necessarily about what you major in, like you said. It's more the skill sets that you get from whatever major it is you learn, right? I was an orientation leader at the University of Florida. Go Gators! It's kind of it's legally it's a contract in my degree where every time
Right,
I
right.
mention the
Check that
university, I have to
box.
say that. So right, right. And on a weekend where Quinnipiac won their first national championship in any sport in men's ice hockey, I,
That's
I
right.
feel like I also have to say go Bobcats. So
There you go.
but that's not the point of this. The point I was trying to get at before my ADD brain took off was that when I was an orientation leader at the University of Florida, go Gators, I one of the things that they told us, and it was a very interesting statistic, was that the number one and number two major undergrad majors of applicants to med school and law school. So people who take the MCAT, people who take the LSAT to try to go into those post professional graduate programs were music, and then I believe after that was English. So it's one of those like, oh, okay, I don't have to major in biology. I don't have to major in chemistry. I don't have to major in economics and government. No, not necessarily. You just have to make sure you learn the skill sets necessary and the qualities necessary to achieve whatever it is that you want to achieve. And then I also think in Tegan's case, I also really enjoyed the story she told about, I believe it was Brett Brown with the Sixers, where she came in to talk to the team and stuff, and he really gave her a really nice introduction, and really kind of set the stage of, hey, I know that this person isn't a professional athlete. I know this person doesn't have the same basketball experience that you NBA players have. But there's something worth taking away from this specific person and her knowledge set. And I think not only was that very important for someone who wasn't a professional basketball player, but I also think in the context of what Tegan was speaking about, and I also think the big takeaway there is because, she's a woman entering and going to talk to a male dominated field, which let's face it, most fields are male dominated. It was very nice to see that someone like Brett Brown, and there are people out there that can see, okay, this person may not have the same background that you have, whether it's in this case, she's a woman walking into a men's basketball team, or to go even deeper in the weeds, she doesn't have that basketball playing experience that these NBA players have. But there's still something worth taking, right? There's still some information that will be beneficial to you in your profession and what you do, even though you may not think that it's relative to it. That's what kind of makes us all human. Everything kind of ties into each other. And I just thought that that was another, tie in that, of course, was with the cloud and the emphasis on a woman working in sports, which should not be, which should not be overlooked at all, but also included that whole, you never know where you're going to get certain traits and tools, um, that her background, and as someone who has a diverse background working in something that they didn't study in per se, you get those tools in those areas and you're able to apply them to your everyday life and your everyday
Yep.
positions.
Yeah, getting endorsements is super helpful. I mean, it seems kind of obvious, but I mean, I've been on the similar receiving end working in soccer and soccer research without like, look, I didn't play past junior high competitively or rec leagues. And I didn't play. Let's just say that. But getting certain analysts to, praise your work in front of the new analyst, the new talent or producer, whatever, Like, it gives you instant credibility, and it's super helpful. It helps you just build confidence in yourself also, but also just makes the whole team that you're joining that much better. So it's
You can just say that Clint Dempsey complimented you. It's okay to say that, Paul.
it
It's
was
okay.
not Clint Dempsey. No, Clint was probably the one just looking skeptical at this nerd with his numbers, if
Just
anything.
deuce face, but at Paul.
Right, exactly. Yeah, he wanted to go fishing, which can't blame him. Good work if you can get it.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you, Sergio. Thanks one more time to Tegan Ashby for joining us on the show. For more baseball guests, check out our archives. We've got conversations with Jonathan Toscas, who oversees advanced scouting for the Nationals, Daniel Adler, now a VP and assistant GM with the Twins, or last week's show, Carlos Munoz, bullpen catcher for Team USA, among many others. As always, we appreciate any feedback and sharing, along with reviews on Apple or wherever you get podcasts. You can reach us on Twitter at True Media Sports, TRU Media Sports, or email us expectedvalue@truemedianetworks.com. On behalf of producer Sergio De La Espriella and all of us here at True Media, I'm Paul Carr. Thank you for listening to Expected Value, the podcast that goes inside the sports analytics world.